Everything began with one question. Not with war, not with hatred, and not even with darkness, but with the brightest angel in heaven. He stood closer to the throne than anyone else. He led the songs of heaven, and millions of angels trusted him without question. His name was Lucifer, and back then, no one could imagine that he would be the one to ask the first question that would crack heaven itself. One day he looked toward the throne and calmly asked something no angel had ever dared to say. Why should one will rule forever? It sounded like philosophy, like a simple thought. But in that moment, the first crack appeared in heaven. At first, they were just conversations, quiet ones, almost harmless. Then came doubt, then sides. And suddenly, 1/3 of the heavenly host was standing with Lucifer. Heaven, which had never known conflict, was preparing for the first war in existence. But here is the part that is truly terrifying. Lucifer lost that war. He fell from heaven into darkness. And that is when he realized something important. He could not defeat heaven with power, but there was another way, a quieter one, a more dangerous one. And it began in a garden, with one small question. The same question that led humanity to make its first mistake. And if you think this story ended thousands of years ago, you are wrong. Because Lucifer's real war was never against heaven. It was always for the human mind. And maybe it's still happening today. I remember the moment before everything changed. Back then, heaven was still perfect. No rebellion, no doubt, no shadows among the angels. And at the center of that perfection stood the brightest being any of us had ever seen. His name was Lucifer. At the time, we admired him. Later, we would realize we were watching the beginning of the greatest fall in existence. I stood among the host of heaven when Lucifer still shone like the morning star. He was not like the rest of us. Even among angels, he stood apart. His presence carried a strange gravity, not the kind that demands attention, the kind that naturally gathers it. When Lucifer moved, the light of heaven seemed to follow him. When he spoke, the halls of heaven grew quiet. Not because we were ordered to listen, because we wanted to. Some angels were warriors, some were messengers. Others guarded the distant edges of creation. Lucifer was something else entirely. He stood closer to the throne than most of us would ever dare approach. Some called him the guardian of the divine mysteries. Others believed he was placed there to reflect the glory of heaven itself. I cannot say which of those was true, but I know this. When the songs of heaven began, Lucifer always led them, and when he sang, the host of heaven followed. At the time, it felt natural. He was brilliant, wise, respected. Of course, the angels followed him. Why wouldn't they? But looking back now, I remember something strange, something I did not understand then. Angels did not only admire Lucifer, they trusted him. I remember watching the others gather around him after the great assemblies. They listened when he spoke, not about commands, not about orders, about ideas, quiet conversations, questions. At first, they sounded harmless, philosophical even. Lucifer never raised his voice, never declared rebellion. He simply wondered, and angels began to listen. One night, if time can even be called night in heaven, I heard the question myself. It was spoken softly, almost thoughtfully, but when the words left his lips, something shifted in the silence around us. Lucifer looked toward the throne, and he asked a question no angel had ever asked before. Not out of anger, not out of rage, but with calm, terrifying curiosity. Why should one will rule forever? At the time, it sounded like philosophy, a thought experiment, a passing question. But later, we would understand something far more frightening. That single thought was the first crack in heaven. And soon, it would become the first rebellion in existence. Rebellion in heaven did not begin with weapons. It began with conversations, quiet ones, the kind no one thinks to fear. At first, Lucifer only spoke to a few of us, and none of us understood that we were standing at the edge of something that had never existed before. Division. After that question, things did not change immediately. Lucifer still stood near the throne. He still led the songs of heaven. He still shone like the morning star we had always known. Nothing looked different. And that was exactly why no one stopped him. But the conversations continued. Small groups of angels began gathering around him, not openly, not like an army, more like listeners around a storyteller. Lucifer never commanded anyone to follow him. That would have been obvious. Instead, he invited them to think. I remember the first time I heard him speak longer about it. His voice was calm, measured, convincing. He did not speak about overthrowing heaven. He spoke about freedom. Lucifer asked questions no angel had ever asked before. Questions that sounded almost reasonable. Why should eternity revolve around a single will? Why should perfection never evolve? Why should power belong to only one? At first, the angels responded with confusion. Some laughed, others dismissed him. But Lucifer had something none of us realized was dangerous: influence. Angels respected him, admired him, trusted him, and slowly, that trust began turning into belief. What made Lucifer so persuasive was not power. It was certainty. He spoke as if he had already seen the future, a different heaven, a freer one where angels were no longer servants, but equals. The change was subtle. Angels who once stood beside the throne began drifting toward Lucifer, not in defiance, in curiosity. Then curiosity became agreement, and agreement became loyalty. I remember noticing familiar faces no longer standing where they used to. They stood closer to him now, listening, waiting, following. At the time, it still looked harmless, a philosophical movement, a debate. But heaven had never experienced disagreement before, and no one knew how quickly it could spread. Then came the moment that changed everything. A whisper passed through the ranks of heaven, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Lucifer was no longer speaking to dozens. He was speaking to thousands. And by the time the truth reached the throne, it was already too late. Nearly 1/3 of the heavenly host had chosen his side. I remember the silence that followed that realization. Heaven had never known betrayal, never known division, never known war. But in that moment, as angels began choosing sides, we understood something terrifying. The rebellion was no longer forming. It had already begun. And soon, heaven itself would become a battlefield. Heaven had never known war. For ages beyond counting, there had only been order, harmony, light. But the moment finally came when silence broke. Not with a whisper, with a collision powerful enough to shake the foundations of creation. And I was there when heaven became a battlefield. The rebellion did not stay hidden forever. It couldn't. Too many angels had chosen Lucifer. Too many voices had begun repeating the same dangerous thought. Soon, the truth reached the throne. And when it did, everything changed. One moment, heaven was still. The next, the sky itself erupted with power. Light clashed against light. Angels who once sang together now stood on opposite sides of the same endless horizon. For the first time in existence, brothers faced brothers. Lucifer stood at the center of it all, radiant, unshaken. His followers gathered behind him like a storm of burning stars, thousands, perhaps more. Angels who once guarded creation now stood ready to challenge it. And Lucifer did not look afraid. He looked certain, as if the throne of heaven was already his. Then another presence entered the battlefield, a force so overwhelming that the entire host felt it at once. Michael. He did not arrive with speeches. He did not argue. He simply appeared, and the light of heaven gathered around him like a living weapon. Where Lucifer brought persuasion, Michael brought authority, and in that moment, the battle truly began. What followed cannot truly be described in human language. Power collided like storms of fire. Angels moved with impossible speed. Shock waves of light tore across the heavens. Every strike carried enough force to reshape entire realms. For the first time, creation itself trembled. Lucifer fought with terrifying brilliance. His voice, once used to lead worship, now commanded an army. His presence ignited the battlefield. Angels followed him without hesitation. For a moment, it almost looked like he might succeed. But heaven does not bend easily. And slowly, the tide began to turn. One by one, Lucifer's followers began to fall. I saw them falling from the heights of heaven like burning stars. Thousands of them. The sky itself seemed to rain light. But Lucifer did not fall with them. Not yet. He remained in the sky, fighting. Brilliant, furious, defiant, until finally, it was only him. I remember the moment clearly, closer than I ever expected to stand. For a brief second, Lucifer turned, and I saw his face. Not fear, not regret, only pride. Then Michael struck, and the brightest being in heaven fell, not slowly, not gently, like lightning torn from the sky. Lucifer plummeted into the abyss below creation, the last star of the rebellion. When the battlefield finally grew silent, we believed the war was over, but we were wrong, because something else had fallen with him. Not just an angel, something darker, something twisted by pride. And far below heaven, Lucifer was beginning to change. Lucifer fell like lightning. And the moment he struck the depths below creation, he changed. The light that once surrounded him was gone. What remained was something colder, sharper, twisted by pride. But Lucifer did not rage in the darkness. He began to think. Because he had just learned something important about war. Force had failed, so he would try something else. Far below heaven, the world of humans had just begun. Creation was still young, untouched, pure. The Garden of Eden stood at the center of it all, a place where nothing had ever gone wrong. No fear, no pain, no betrayal. Adam and Eve walked the garden freely, unaware that the first enemy of heaven had turned his attention toward them. I remember watching from the edge of the heavens. We had been commanded to observe, to protect the order of creation. But what happened next, none of us expected. Lucifer did not arrive with armies. He did not bring fire. He did not even reveal his true form. Instead, he entered the garden as something small, a serpent, quiet, patient, almost invisible among the trees. I saw him approach Eve slowly. No violence, no threats, only silence. For a long moment, he simply watched her, studying, calculating. Lucifer had once tried to conquer heaven with power, but now he was trying something far more dangerous, understanding. Then, finally, the serpent spoke. Only one sentence, cold, calm, perfectly placed. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? It was such a small question, almost harmless. But I felt something shift the moment Eve hesitated. Lucifer had discovered something terrifying about humanity. They did not need force to fall. They only needed doubt. And doubt begins with questions. Eve answered. Then the serpent answered again, carefully, quietly, each word bending the truth just enough to make it sound reasonable. No shouting, no commands, only suggestion. And slowly, the balance of innocence began to break. When Eve finally reached for the fruit, Lucifer did not celebrate. He simply watched. Because in that moment, he understood something greater than victory. He had discovered the perfect weapon. Humans could be turned against heaven without ever realizing it. All it took was the right question. The moment the fruit was taken, something changed across creation. Innocence vanished. Shame appeared where none had existed before. And as the gates of Eden slowly closed behind humanity, Lucifer understood that the war had entered a new battlefield. Not heaven, not earth, but the human mind. Lucifer had lost heaven, but he had not stopped fighting. His battlefield simply changed. From that moment forward, the war moved quietly through human history. Not with armies, with influence, and for ages, it worked. From where we watched above, the change in humanity was impossible to ignore. The world that began in innocence slowly began to fracture. The first betrayal, the first murder, the first war. Civilizations rose with ambition and collapsed under the weight of their own pride. Kings crowned themselves as gods. Empires conquered in the name of power. Greed, envy, and corruption spread through generations like a shadow stretching across time. Lucifer no longer needed to appear in the open. His ideas were enough. A whisper here, a temptation there, a carefully planted thought. And humanity continued doing the rest. That was his greatest discovery. He did not need to rule the world. He only needed to influence the hearts of those who did. And for centuries, he remained the unseen architect of rebellion. But there was always something Lucifer failed to understand. The story of creation was never his to control. From the very beginning, there was an ending already written, an ending even Lucifer could not escape. Time passed, generations came and went, but the moment described in prophecy slowly moved closer, the final reckoning. The ancient writings speak clearly about what happens next. There is no great battle, no dramatic war, no chance for Lucifer to rise again. When the final moment arrives, it ends almost instantly. The deceiver who once stirred rebellion across heaven and earth is seized, not by strength, by judgment. The authority he once wielded disappears. The voice that once persuaded angels and kings alike falls silent. And Lucifer, once the brightest being in heaven, is cast into the final prison prepared for him. Not a throne, not a kingdom, an end. Even now, after everything that happened, I still remember what he used to be. I remember when Lucifer stood among us, radiant, wise, respected. I remember when he led the songs of heaven, and sometimes I wonder what might have happened if that first thought had never taken root, if pride had never replaced humility. Because Lucifer did not begin as a monster. He began as the brightest among us. And that is the part of this story most people forget. Evil did not begin in darkness. It began in light. Because sometimes, the brightest light can cast the darkest shadow.